Hello.
I'm Bec,
And I'm Annie.
and welcome to the Career Coven. This is episode 8, which is on resilience today. You and I feel like we have quite a lot to say about this, Annie.
Yeah, good and bad. I used to maybe I'll just open with it. When I was in my first job, or one of my first jobs, my boss always used to tell me to be resilient, and I hated that term. I thought, like, why the fuck are you telling me to be resilient? Like, that's just you telling me to kind of put up with nonsense.
Mm.
Um But I now, like, deeply understand that that is not what it means. But, um but yeah, I used to think that that term was just a bit of an excuse to say, like, just keep going under all costs, keep going, and that's not really what it means, is it?
I mean, similarly, I was told to cry less in my first job, and I'm grateful for that feedback because I do cry less, and I think that's good feedback. Um,
That's useful. It's actionable as well.
sort of cut from the same cloth, but shall we unpack it? What do we mean by resilience? What do we think it is and it isn't?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it is, like, bouncing back from setbacks and doing that and still being able to, like, push through and be positive and, like, keep on track. I read one definition that said it is being able to bounce back gracefully, which I thought, I'm not actually sure that is what resilience is, but I think it is, like, being able to get back to, like, still feeling very positive after, like, significant setbacks, which we literally all have in our career, right? Like, everyone faces setbacks. So, what do you think it is?
Yeah, I would agree. I think when I was doing a mental health first aid course, a really useful exercise that they get you to do, and you can do it with others, is to talk about like a stress bucket. And you list out literally everything that is stressing you out that goes into the bucket, and then you work on okay, well, where are the holes in the bucket, which are your coping mechanisms? So, how are those stresses flowing out? And is the bucket too full and overflowing, or have you got the right balance of your stresses and your kind of coping mechanisms? And I think that's a really nice way of just, for
Mm,
me, thinking about how you hit an equilibrium of being resilient is just making sure that you are doing enough to be able to cope successfully with the kind of setbacks and stresses that come in. Obviously, setbacks and stresses might vary widely in scale. I think probably for the purposes of today, we're talking about like day to day stresses rather than like a very traumatic event. But I think it is like we have stress all the time, everywhere. Like getting on the tube is stressful. So I think it's about making sure that you try and reduce the volume of stressors, but also that you have better coping mechanisms to deal with those stresses as well. I think to me, that's the kind of balance that we need to get to with resilience.
yeah, exactly. And I think falling within that to an extent is, like, I think it's a learned behavior. It's not something that you innately, like, are born with or have. I do think, people who have had very stressful childhoods have probably, like, learned coping mechanisms for stress earlier. Some of those can be really good and some of those can be really negative because you learn them when you're quite young. But I would definitely say that um it's something that you can develop resilience over the course of your career and your life, um, rather than it being something that just some people have and some people don't. But I do think the baseline is possibly different for different people, or actually definitely different for different people.
Yeah, and I also think it gets easier to be resilient over time when I was watching this great clip on Instagram that I'm never going to be able to find for the show notes, but I'll try. It was from Sarah Pascoe, and she'd been asked a question about like her younger self, and she was talking in her response about how the first heartbreak that you feel feels like the worst thing in the world because you've never experienced it before and you don't know that it's going to be okay. and then you keep going through heartbreak, and then it gets easier and you have another data point to contextualize it, and so on. And I think that also just applies like at work or anywhere else in your life, where if you know that something bad is going to happen and it's going to be fine after, you feel less nervous about the thing that's happening.
Yeah, and I forget that all the time because I feel like I've done so many different jobs in such a short space of time. But like I feel like I've seen a lot for my kind of 13 or 14 years working, which is great actually, because I think it means that I find lots of things not that stressful anymore because I've just seen such a big variety of situations. But I can also say that I'm very guilty of like forgetting that other people don't have that like breadth of experience, and that other things can, that I don't find as stressful anymore, can still be really, really stressful. As you say, the first time you see something happen, like someone gets fired from a team, like that can be really stressful if you've never been in a team where someone gets fired. And it can lead people to kind of panic and maybe feel less resilient and be really stressed. But like, once you've been in as many teams as we have, and you've seen that that's just part of the course of working, and it's not a big, it's not a big deal, and those people usually find a new job and are completely fine, then it all gets a lot less stressful.
Yeah, definitely. So is there a particular time that you have in your mind, if we think about like why resilience is important, is I have one in my mind, but I'm going to ask you first. Is there a point in your career where you've hit the red zone and that's made you learn how important it is?
Yeah, I think there's 2 points for me. One is very early, like, and I think a lot of people hit like almost a red zone, or a lot of like type A personalities almost hit a red zone in their first job because they're just like so much to prove, and like, oh my gosh. So I would definitely say there was one of my first job, and then obviously maybe it's not obvious, but for me, the main one is my company, and the end of that experience, the last few months of Alva were extraordinarily tough for me on a personal basis. I really was so stressed, and I didn't have a visualization of a bucket, but if I had, the bucket would have been like out the window. It was so full, I would have dropped it. And Susan's barking because she's like, we don't talk about this. We do not talk about this period. We've just blocked this out. But I think the thing that happened is I was really stressed, and I was trying to like do a lot of things for the company and the team, and like just keep everything normal for everyone else. And inside, was really, really struggling with all the things that were on my plate, and just the amount of pressure I was putting on myself, just all me stuff. And then I stopped kind of looking after myself, and I think we'll kind of go into how self-care kind of fits into managing yourself and managing resilience. Now, what I can see is I do think I was quite resilient for quite a long time in that chapter, but as soon as I lost the ability to like think positively at all, that was, it was gone. It was like once I lost sight of the goal, which I definitely did a bit, I towards the very, very end, literally the last kind of couple of weeks, it was all quite fast. Then it was like, I just can't keep this up. Like I've lost that, you know, lost that longer term perspective. And
How did you recognize that you were at that point, or was it someone else who recognized it for you?
it was definitely someone else. Yeah, yeah. But I didn't talk to that many people, but I was lucky that I spoke to my family. I could recognize that like I was stressed, I was stressed, but I couldn't fully see the extent to which I had kind of lost my way. And it really materialized, like for me, a lack of resilience really materialized in like intense, like my self-confidence, it just went. Like I had it for ages, I was fine, and then it just went. And all of a sudden it was like all that hatred and like pain, it just turned inwards, it didn't turn towards anyone else. And yeah, as soon as that happened, it was like, okay, no, we've like crossed into the abyss of like not a good place now. And then, you know, it wasn't a terrible story. Like the outcome was actually fine for the technology, and etc., etc. There is a happy ending to this, like, you know, low, but definitely it was a very, very tough time. And I think, yeah, the critical moment for me was when I lost that, like, ability to see the long term. And then it was very hard to stay resilient, because I think that's what you need. You need this kind of longer term game, a longer term view
You
of
also just need a bit of hope, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Hope is so powerful, even if it's just a tiny shred of it. But if you can't feel hopeful about anything, that's really difficult.
Yeah. And I also, you know, I started to, which I think is quite normal when you get in a bit of a panic and you lose resilience and stuff, is like I started to really obsess over the things I couldn't do, and not all the things, the many things that I was still doing and that I could do. What about you? What was your time?
But mine was like during my COVID crisis response, and I find it really fascinating when I reflect back on this, because actually I don't remember a lot of it, and something has happened in my brain where like I have not actually processed the memory correctly about that period. But um you know, it was right at the beginning of COVID was when I was made to run the COVID policy team for my department, and that was like, you know, closing and reopening sectors and people dying, and you don't know what's happening. And in 2020 there was, you know, no vaccinations, no one knew anything. 2021, you know, you have 60,000 new cases a day in the UK, and it's grim. It's really grim, and you sort of do whatever you can with the tools that you have, which are really limited, with a bunch of politicians who you just general election, register to vote.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, but I what I found really fascinating was that everyone that, you know, I would turn up to work every day. I would do the work. I would, you know, it would start from about 6 a.m. I would be working until I go to sleep. I'd try to go to sleep at midnight. I'd have a horrible broken sleep where I'd just like panic wake up being like, here are all the things I haven't done. And that's just what my work was like for basically on off 2 years. And at the time everyone was sort of like, the work that you're doing is like amazing and it's really incredible, and you get all of these really nice compliments about like basically just destroying yourself for work. And I think I remember in the first lockdown in sort of June 2020, my resilience, my sort of like display of stress is just to like bottle until like it's way too late, and then to like fully
me,
explode.
me
um,
too.
it's really healthy. um, and I remember having one of those, and then I was like, I need to have a break from doing this role, and they replaced me with 3 people. And I was like, oh yeah, fucking, I should have probably said something earlier.
Yeah,
But you know, part of resilience.
parallel.
Hmm?
Like that is a very interesting parallel between both of us, actually. It's like I know that if I'd like kind of admitted to myself like some stuff earlier, would have been a totally different outcome. But
Yeah,
I just, you know, you just don't. You're just like a heads down kind of operations,
you
you know.
also just don't want to be like, I can't do it. You like, you
Yeah,
don't want to say that to yourself, and you don't want to say that to other people. You want to be like, I want to be the person who can do it. And actually
yeah,
that's total self-sabotage in the long term, by doing that. So um I it only really occurred to me after I left crisis response. I went on this unbelievably beautiful holiday. We went to the Maldives. It was meant to be our honeymoon. We booked it on Black Friday in 2020 when it cost nothing. And
good
our
tip.
wedding got our wedding got rescheduled, so we went on our honeymoon before we got married anyway. And I just felt like in this like totally disassociated days, like the whole time, where I couldn't decompress, and like it was the most beautiful holiday, but I had a horrible time. And
Mm,
actually, since I've left that, it's taken me months and years to kind of process it. But what I know for sure is that there were so many physiological signs of just
mm,
really chronic exposure to stress and cortisol, and like the way I just totally ignored for years, like um I got this like chronic eczema that wouldn't go away, that was like inflammation triggered, and like there's obviously something happening in my immune system with like
yeah,
inflammation and like sleeping badly and like having insomnia for so long and all those kinds of things. And you're like, your ability to totally ignore some really obvious signs is kind of astonishing.
Yeah, amazing. Amazing. And I mean, I did that even though it was my literal job every single day to to tell women how to look after themselves, how to look after their hormones, how to like manage yourself, like how to manage your stress, blah 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 blah, the importance of not being too stressed in menopause. And actually all the physiological like mechanisms are kind of the same. Like if you make cortisol too much, you make it over estrogen, so your estrogen depletes, and then as a woman, your cycles change, and etc etc, and that everything's connected, right? And that was my literal full-time all the time job. And people were like, what, like, why can't you apply any of this to yourself? And I was like, I'm different. But the thing
I
is, I didn't really believe I was different. It was what you said, which is like, I just wanted to prove I could do it all the
mm,
time.
I think I haven't actually read this book, so that comes with that caveat. But lots of people have been recommending to me The Body Keeps the Score, which I think has probably more childhood trauma in than I'm comfortable talking about as an armchair psychologist for once. But there are some really interesting points around like how cortisol manifests physically. And yeah, I think it's about how overwhelming experiences impact you in how you conduct yourself. And one of the things that I was reading about was that you can have kind of chronic exposure to stress manifest in things from like not being able to pay attention, but it could also be things like hyper focus, which I think is something that I identify with much more than I do with having a short attention span, is when you kind of want to disassociate from your experience and get really thrown into something. And I think that was probably the whole of my COVID experience. But it
Hmm.
is just really fascinating, I think, taking a step back on the kind of physical experience of resilience, because I think the emotional experience gets quite a lot of attention, but the physical experience is always there.
Yeah, and they're totally interconnected, right? Like, I think you'd rarely meet someone who was at the bottom of their emotional resilience bucket and that they were like, but I'm feeling great, physically, I'm absolutely amazing. Like, those two things just don't happen because obviously the mind and body are connected. And yeah, I have read that book and it is good. It is good. I definitely, you can definitely, if you read it when you're in the trauma, which I did, I was like, I'm fucked. I'm fucked for the rest of my life. I'm now physically just totally going to be fucked forever. But actually, that's not the message of the book, and it is a very useful and a very good book. So those are our sub stories, are they not? Our sub stories.
Yeah, that's doesn't get much worse than that.
So what makes you more resilient now?
I think I have like an approach that a lot of people will disagree with, and it sort of contravenes any bit of career advice I've ever been given or anyone's ever received, which is basically just you could just care less about work. Um,
The
and
care.
caring less for me is really good at keeping work in perspective. Doesn't mean that I don't care, but um, I just I sort of promised myself that I would never let my career get to the point that it was so important to me that it would be the sacrifice of literally everything else. And when you kind of step off that podium and go, oh, there's so much other shit I could be doing or excited about or care about,
Yeah.
it's a lot easier to just not give a shit when like someone's being really rude or annoying, or a decision is made that you don't agree with, because you're like, oh well, whatever, we're here now, so let's just get on with it. And I think it just puts me in a more pragmatic mindset.
Yeah. So I remember like deep in the depths of my despair, my brother had a phone call with me where he told me to do this. He just said he's like a huge kind of nihilist, like believes that nothing means anything except for love. And he's actually not like a hippie, but through his lived experience, he has been like, it's all kind of meaningless except for just like who you love and the people around you. I can't get to that. Like I can't, just full disclosure, I can't get to that level of like inner peace. But yeah, he called me as, you know, all the worst of the stuff was happening, and he spoke to me for 2 hours, and he just basically tried to convince me that, you know, it was all pointless. Like it was all pointless.
Oh, I bet that's a difficult pill to swallow in that mindset, though.
Yeah, I was like so far in the other direction. Like I was just so far in like the the only thing that matters is like, can I pay my team and like what I'm doing, that I had just lost complete perspective on what was important. And so although him telling me that it was pointless was not useful, it was useful to the extent where I was like, whoa, okay, it's probably somewhere in the middle. Like, I do really believe that how you spend your time does matter, and like that you can have a great impact on people with how you spend your time. But like, I also respect his opinion, which is, you know, that jobs and stuff can be a bit pointless to some people, and they are a means to an end, and that end for a lot of people is like your family life or your personal life, or, you know, your cats and dogs, and the things that you love doing and how you like spending your time. And so I think that is really, really useful. I had to land somewhere in the middle. And
Yeah,
what have you, to be honest, because it's not like you've gone, oh, like sack off my career. You're like still in fucking high powered place. You're just maybe not doing that to the point where you can't enjoy your life outside of it at all.
yeah. I think like I enjoy work for the fact that like I'm mentally stimulated and socially and emotionally stimulated by what goes on at work, but it's not the only thing that gets me going. It's not the only thing that gets me excited. And I do think that um, a part of being resilient is having other things going on in your life so that when some things get bad, you have other things to lean on, like this little poddy, you know. I've had a bad day at work, but we've got a pod recording. What a beautiful way to end the day.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And I think, yeah, when all the things are really bad, like all the parts of life are really unstable or really bad, or like have trauma in, which was, to be honest, what I was going through in those years to an extent. Um, the experience is just, it's just numbing. It's just like
Mm.
numbing levels of like overwhelm and pain. So I think it is really good advice to like be able to see, okay, you know, if your job gets bad, maybe your relationship's good, and like there are some things that are kind of much more constant, like your relationship or like your dog or your children. Those things aren't similar, but I've just said them in that order now. um that are like more permanent than kind of one job or one meeting or one experience. And I think, you know, probably making sure that your time is balanced over the things that are really permanently important and the things that are like, you know, short term high pressure important is also like another thing to look at.
Yeah. What else have you got on your list? What do you think makes you resilient now?
So now I'm like so comfortable with failure that maybe it's a development area. Like I sort of expect that lots of things that you hope will succeed will not succeed fully or will fail, and that is just like part of life. And I think that that came from the one thing I wanted to succeed most failing ultimately, in my eyes anyway. And that's been really perspective giving, because almost like I've lost this one thing that I wanted so much that now like everything else seems much smaller and much more manageable, because I will never go through that experience again. Um, I also take a much more like long-term view of everything. Like I sort of understand that I can't control everything happening day to day, and I don't see it as worth my time to try and control it. I think it's more about how you kind of adapt and roll with the punches and still try and like get what you need to done. And kind of looking at my job in that way has made it all much kind of more interesting and much kind of easier to get through, because I kind of see everything as like, oh, I wonder if I could do that. Let's give it a try. Rather than like all the pressure I used to put on myself, which did lead to an erosion of my resilience, was like a lot of it was just self pressure. You know, like you said, you just wanted to win, prove that you could do it. Like that to me now, I do put pressure on myself because I like doing a lot of stuff. I like achieving. I like solving problems, but I think I do that in a way of, it's just more curious, and I have a much more long-term view of like the 40 years more I'm going to work, um which I just didn't have at Alpha. I really was like, this is my entire life for the rest of my life forever. And now it all sounds honestly naive, but that is, you know, that's how I thought when I was doing, you know, my own thing that I cared about so much. So yeah, I've got a few things in there that have helped me. What else has helped
I
you?
liked I like what you said about control, and I think that's like genuinely where I focus most of my like resilience philosophy around. It's like I only worry about things that I can control directly or
Mm,
I can influence. But even influencing, you get into a bit of a like, could I actually influence this, or is that wishful thinking that I can influence something? But focusing on those two areas of like, these are the areas that I can make change and actually make a difference, and then you just have to shut down the noise on the rest. Like there's
mm,
so much stuff you could worry about. There's literally an infinite list,
mm.
that's just not productive. Like worrying about it doesn't change anything for you. But I think one of the I think we've spoken about this before, but one of the I have a journal. I'm like shit at discipline of journaling, and I only basically journal when I am having a moment. And so my journal reads as like this horrible like tome of bad moods. Um, but
That's exactly the same as me.
I
Exactly the same as me.
like if that was my legacy, if I just suddenly died and they found that notebook, they'd be like, oh, what is wrong with her? um but when I'm feeling like overwhelmed, what I like to do is to do a really messy mind map where I write down literally every single thing that I'm thinking about that's taking up my headspace, and then I'll work out like which of those. I like pick three, get a highlighter, circle them, and the whole page looks like a big mess. But you pick the three areas that you think will have the biggest impact on improving your mood and is in your control. And
Yeah.
if you just do those three things, it's honestly, it's like having medicine for your mind. Just even writing it down is really helpful.
Yeah, that's an amazing tip. And I definitely agree with like writing it down for sure. It helps me like process and structure like what I'm actually thinking. But yeah, it's funny because if you read my diaries, or I don't even know if they're diaries, they're just sort of like scribbles.
It's
But
just like sort of gibberish in like an incoherent bad mood of some description. Um,
yeah, there's a lot of like one words that are just underlined just just so many times for me. But
I think the other thing that like I am much better at now, and I always kind of coach people on, is developing an understanding and self-awareness about when you're entering your red zone. Like I always think
mm,
of resilience like a battery, and you can only go so long on a battery without recharging it, and you hit the red zone, and that's like your iPhone going like, we need to go in low battery mode. And the longer that you leave it going closer to the red zone, the longer it takes to recharge. And you have to be able to recognize when you go into the red. And like there are always signals for me. It will be like I will start sleeping badly is normally the first one. And they always say sleep is the gateway to like mental health more
agreed.
generally.
Yeah,
Um,
so important. Yeah.
yeah, so I think just knowing when you're hitting the red zone and managing that actively rather than just slipping further into the red zone. And I think
Yeah, 100.
everyone's going to have different coping mechanisms. Like mine is just like definitely sleeping, and not overscheduling, and decompressing between work and bedtime. And I spent so much of my life working on sleep hygiene because I had insomnia. Why We Sleep, excellent book. Don't know if you've read it, but
Yeah, I have read that. Yeah, another excellent one. Very important.
fantastic.
And I agree, sleep is always one of the things to go like pretty early, I think, for a lot of people actually. But as you say, some people don't recognize it. They think, oh, it's just not sleeping that well, just a bit restless. And um, but if that goes on for a long time, it really, really can affect your resilience, your decision making, you know.
I
And
just also, if I'm short on like 90 minutes of sleep in a given night, like I am without a doubt a wreck the next day, and like so much more reactive, so much more emotional, so much more irritable. Like it really makes such a big difference. I mean, the other thing that, like, we've spoken about this before, you do a lot of exercise. I normally like to go to boxing, especially when things get spicy at work because you feel like you're punching someone. But it is, I think, getting out of your mind and completely tiring yourself out gets some of those jitters and reactions out of you.
yeah, 100%. And that is the first thing to go for me is I stop exercising. And, I wasn't exercising at all during that period. I was just working like every living, breathing moment. And I wasn't sleeping very much either, both of which, now I would see as things to be very careful with. But yeah. And I think the last thing that helps me be a lot more resilient is like, and maybe you will disagree with it, you work in very different environment to me, but in general, in small teams, I think most things aren't personal. They are
Mm.
like totally professional. Even things that feel really personal often aren't personal to you at all. They're about like other stuff. And I definitely think so much more about that when I have like a terrible meeting or like something goes wrong or like I feel like someone's just, being a bit off or I'm finding it hard. I'm like, this isn't going to be about me. And I think not necessarily that the alpha stuff, but definitely earlier on, if I think of like other times where I felt less resilient, I've also probably thought that like the world was kind of revolving around me a lot and almost been a bit paranoid of like, why don't they like me? Like all of this stuff. And now I'm like, that is not what is going on. Like that is not what is going on at all.
I
Um,
think it's really easy to come up with some sort of like weird self-centered conspiracy theory about how everyone is like existing in the world to annoy you
yeah,
personally, and like that's just not happening. Like I tend, it's taken me a while to get to this, but like I try to always assume positive intent, um and where I sort of catch myself assuming something else, I'll go, okay, but what if it was actually just them being incompetent? And then I feel better.
yeah, I think assuming positive intent and also like establishing positive intent can also be helpful. Like if you're in a meeting and things get a bit tense, you can be like, look, we're all here for the same reason, which is, X, right? And if everyone's like, yeah, actually, we are all here for the same reason, and that is X, and you could like reset things that are starting to feel a bit like ugh by sort of agreeing that everyone's actually just trying to do like a thing and it is the same thing even if everyone's coming in at their own little angle and their own little perspective. But I think when I was younger and I had less experience, and I do think this is linked to like time and experience like you said at the start, but when I was younger that all felt like very kind of personal and hard to cope with and hard to kind of process, whereas now it's like what.
No one actually cares about you, turns out.
Exactly, but that is like, it's a bit of the same kind of philosophy as like it's not that important. It's like a bit of just care less for better outcomes. Like care less so not to like kill yourself with worry and like, make yourself feel really bad. Just care slightly less. Focus on the outcome, not the path to it. So yeah, those are a few of the things that I think have got better. One thing I want to talk about is some practical tips for people to increase their resilience.
Hmm.
Short fire, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, five. That wouldn't be very short. 5 points from you to just increase your resilience if you think you're getting into that red zone or you just want to top up of your resilience.
Number one, book a holiday.
Great.
Just have some time off.
Yeah, I really.
Okay, you go next.
Number two, think about failure as an opportunity to learn. We've talked about this so much that I almost don't want to say it, but it is very, very useful in the world of low resilience. Susan is barking to agree.
um, okay, next, number three, I would go. Um, I think just take a walk. If you find
Mm.
yourself in a work day and you're like on the edge of just any emotion that makes you not feel good, just shut your laptop down, go outside. Um, I love a little walk break, especially when you're about to have a like fizzing moment at your laptop. I think it's really helpful.
Yeah, I think you said it, but it's like identifying what is within your control and what you can change in a situation, and then what isn't, and only kind of focusing your energy on the things that you can make progress with and you can kind of control. Last one, you.
Okay, I'm going to try and condense a long point I made earlier into something short. If you're faced with a particular thing that you find triggering, you could just go, what is the consequence of me not caring about this specific thing?
I like that. I like
Okay,
that.
right.
Okay.
Let's talk about self care and resilience.
Mm, mm.
As
Vivi,
someone who's professed not to have looked after themselves,
yes, yes. I
don't
mean,
share.
I think that self-care, like some people see it as like a bit of a dirty word, and some people see it as like something to absolutely obsess over, right? And I'm definitely somewhere in the middle. I'm like, let's do some self-care for sure. But I'm not going to spend all my time self-caring. Like I'm not just going to constantly be in the bath with a face mask, kind of listening to the Archers or whatever I would do. I'm not sure I'd listen to the Archers, but that's what I said. Um, yeah, but I think it's really important for the reasons that we've both said, which is like it is an opportunity to kind of recharge your own batteries, to like take stock of what has happened in your day and understand like the things you can't change, how like the things that are stressing you out, the things that are going well. Like I see self-care as not just like putting on a face mask, it's actually just giving yourself time. I think often that time is alone actually, and like not talking to other people. A walk, like you said, is another really good moment for like a micro dose of sort of self-care in the middle of a day, is to just kind of let yourself go on a walk and kind of process stuff. But yeah, I think having kind of extremely not cared for myself for probably two straight years, I would say that and what I was doing instead is I was just working. I was just trying to do output and like move stuff, and that probably wasn't that successful because God knows what I was doing all the time. But I just didn't have a single boundary between Alva and me. If someone got in touch on the phone line at 12 at night, I would pick up, which
No.
nuts, right? It's like I didn't want that person to feel like they were alone. But that was like way beyond the realms of like what was normal. Um, so I think I can say with like clear and definitive truth that like going that long without any self-care is really a route to nowhere. But I think there are really practical things that are kind of termed within self-care, which is just like for me, self-care is just a moment or some moments to prioritize yourself, just be on your own, like take a bit of a breath, and whatever you do to kind of relax, like do that thing. So I think if I had done more exercise, if I had, you know, I'm trying to think of other things I enjoy, but now the only thing coming up is exercise.
That's going to be very unrelatable to a lot of people, Annie. But um, but I agree with you, and I think like I have a when I was going through CBT, I have an iPhone notes of like things to remind me when I sort of lose perspective a bit of the things that I enjoy doing that are like really quick and
Mm,
easy things. Um,
good idea. That's a practical tip. To
yeah, And it's just, you know, when you lose a bit of track of yourself, that's a nice way to just remind yourself that, like, there are things that you like doing that are actually nothing to do with work, and you should go and do some of those. I think we haven't spoken about it directly, but I think it's probably important to touch on is resilience and the Venn diagram of mental health overall. I think there's coping mechanisms that are obviously healthy ones and ones that are like less healthy. Like, I think if you're having a really tough time at work and you're not sure about your resilience, and you spend all of Saturday watching a TV show and disassociating, like, that's probably not that healthy. I mean, but I sometimes do that, not as a coping mechanism because I actively enjoy it, but never mind.
That's rotting, and that's different, Beck.
Rotting is different.
Rotting is self-care. Let's be really
Uh,
clear. If you're highly engaged and you're texting your friendship group about what is happening in your series and you're excited, that's self-care. If you're like staring blankly at Love Island from the bath, that's something different.
yeah, and I think you know, like, I don't know, 5 years ago, if you'd asked me, like, what are my coping mechanisms for a hard time at work, I'd probably say I'd just go to the pub with my colleagues and blow off some steam. And actually, you know, alcohol is not a particularly good coping mechanism at all, because that will just make you feel worse longer term. And there's, you know, lots of other issues with that. But, you know, there's nothing wrong with a glass of wine here or there.
Yeah, and that is most people's. That is a very normalized coping mechanism. I think that is still the majority of people's kind of coping mechanism, though it is changing, right? That was definitely mine. You know, it's not like I didn't drink for 2 years. I did. Like,
Yeah.
there were nights when I like saw people and had fun. It was COVID, so it was not, you know, that often. But it wasn't good for me. Like, when I wasn't feeling resilient, to have a drink was very, very bad,
I
actually.
think it's also like you when you're in that mode, you're kind of just like, oh, fuck it. And then you're like, I'm just gonna get really drunk. And then you're like, wow, I feel the worst I've ever felt. And I feel lower the day after than I did before I started drinking. So, you know,
Yeah.
a bit of a slippery slope.
The anxiety is really real. And
Also,
I
that
think
was
it's good.
at 30, anxiety just opened its little door to me, and I was like, actually makes me not want to drink. It's horrific.
Agreed, agreed. But I think it's good that people are kind of talking about that a little bit more now. And it does seem like things are going in a slightly better direction in terms of, you know, work, social stuff, not only being like 100% just drinking now. But yeah, I agree. Some coping mechanisms are healthier than others, for sure.
Yeah, and I would also say, like, if there is someone listening to this who feels like they've tried healthy coping mechanisms and they feel like they still don't feel better for that, then I would just say go to your GP and talk to
Agreed.
them, because, you know, there is a spectrum of this conversation, which is actually, this is a mental health issue,
Yeah.
and, you know, you and I are not qualified to have that conversation, but the GP certainly is, and there's many things
Yeah.
that someone could seek as interventions, which, you know, range from like talking therapies or lifestyle changes or medication or whatever. But, you know, I think if you've tried and you still feel like on the edge of tears
A hun-
constantly, then like that's a really big red flag to go and look after yourself.
Exactly. And that's not normal in the way that like you shouldn't put up with that. And I think that there are loads of, as you say, medical and non kind of pharmaceutical but medically credible interventions that you can take when you are just really, really struggling to cope. And there is like absolutely no shame in taking them. You know, it's like one in three or one in four GP appointments now are about mental health. And I think that should show that like it is a hard world to like cope in, and it's really normal to sometimes need a bit of help. And so yeah, I think it's really, really important for us to say that, yeah, long term, if you're feeling like you can't cope, or if you're feeling like everything is just too much, there are different ways that you can seek help. And we will put some of those in the show notes as well, because it is a very, very good point. And there's nothing to be ashamed of, especially if work is getting you down. Like, there isn't anything wrong with that being the cause. And I think some people feel like really ashamed. You know, it's just my job. It's just this. It's like, no, it's not. It's your life, because we work for a lot of our lives, and
Mm.
work is just one part of your broad life. And so if it's making you feel really bad, and you yeah, and you need to seek help, there's
Yeah, I
no.
mean, you can totally have like low mood that has been circumstantially triggered by work. That's an extremely common thing to experience. And I think, one of the, in order for you to go to the GP, it will require you to hold up a mirror to yourself that things aren't working out. But I think the more that everyone does to take the sting out of that, the better, because, everyone should thrive. We all deserve to thrive.
Yeah, exactly. And for different people, it takes different things to help you thrive. Like everyone is different, and what works for one person won't work for another. On that, I think there is something about, is it easier to, well, for you, I guess, personally, Beck, was it easier for you to kind of find a more resilient place alone, or did you seek the help of other people? Do you seek the help of other people? I'm just curious as to whether we think that you can like find resilience totally on your own
It's a
before.
really good question, because I really believe, for me, what it took most of all is for me to recognize in myself that I wasn't okay. And
Mm,
I think I had to make that change first before I started making good changes about my own resilience. But
mm.
everyone around you is the support network that brings you back up. I don't think you can tell someone and then they'll immediately listen, like, you need to go and fix your brain. Like, I
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
I don't think that's like the path to change. I think the path to change is me saying I need to fix my brain. um but I
yeah.
think you need everyone around you. What about you?
Hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting one because I definitely think there were, as I said, there were pivotal people in my life who did start to kind of hold up a mirror and be like, no,
Mm,
like that's not normal. What you just said is not normal at all, and it's not okay. And that was when it was like, oh, those were probably the things that impacted my kind of self-realization the most. As I was like, oh, that was quite a strong reaction, that one.
mm.
Um, but yeah, you can only change the things you want to change. The same way that you can't, I couldn't have seen you in that time and been like, "Come on, Beck, let's just get a bit more positive and resilient. Come on,
Yeah,
let's like let's
I would have told
reframe
you to
it."
fuck off, like.
Exactly, exactly. And you can never change people who don't want to change. And so yeah, I think I agree with you that it is about your own kind of self-discovery of like something isn't right. But I do think people can be really important reflectors of like what's going on with you. And I think that I would have been even slower to realize what was going on had I not had people start to say no.
Yeah, I mean, if you are in that kind of headspace, you probably don't have that amazing self-awareness, but you're probably also in denial. So like that self-reflection process may not be the best one at all. And sometimes like it is actually helpful to have someone being like, are you okay? That's kind of insane.
Yeah.
As to kind of prompt you into that mode.
Yeah, and then I think, as you said, on the recovery side, I think it is much harder to like recover and process, from these moments like totally on your own. I think trying to be able to find a few people, and it doesn't really matter whether they're professionals or whether they're friends or family or whoever really, but that you can talk to to them about this stuff, like how you're feeling,
Mm.
what's going on. I think it is really important because when you're just being very quiet, you know people don't really know how to help you.
Well,
And
they just can't read your mind, right? And like, especially if it's like over WhatsApp and you just don't reply, like they don't know what's going on.
yeah, and we know people that have done that, not replied over WhatsApp, and people have been really, the people texting are really concerned,
Yeah.
right? And I do that. I did that at Alva, right? I definitely lost friends over those 2-year periods because I couldn't face replying. It was like, "How are you?" And I was like, "Oh, if you the real answer to that question is something that most people I don't think really want to read during COVID. But actually, like, that was that should have been a moment where I was like, "Oh, that's sad, I don't wanna send this text." But I was just overwhelmed. I was like, "I can't kind of cope with all of this." But as I started to talk to people about the way I felt and, like, recover from this, the majority of people were like, "I've been there." I've had that moment myself. And then in that like common ground, as we are kind of talking about it today, you realize that like this is part of it. Like this is part of most people's journeys is and figuring out for yourself what works and what doesn't is part of this like journey that we're all on with our careers and our life. But you don't know that if you aren't able to talk to anyone
Mm.
how you're feeling or what's happened to you, and if you have a lot of shame about stuff. So I would definitely say it doesn't have to be everyone, but like it's really, really helpful to have people to talk to as you start on that recovery from whatever you're going through. Just because once you've said things out loud, they sort of they take on a voice of like a meaning of their own, and they're real, and then you can't get away from the fact that you were feeling that way.
Mm.
Someone's reaction to it, I think, helps you process like, my God, that was extreme, or that was, that is something that I felt too. And like, that is something I think other people feel. And I was really surprised how many people kind of said to me, you know, no one's got the same journey, but like, I've definitely been here and I'm so sorry. And are you okay? And what can I do? And, the answer was usually nothing, right? But they listened, and that was really
It's
helpful.
not even really about them doing anything. It's just about like empathizing. And I think, anything that makes your experience feel less isolating makes it feel better.
Right. One last question, and then I think we're wrapped with this because it's hitting on an hour.
Go.
Um, do you have to be optimistic back to be resilient?
I don't think so. I say this because I don't feel like I'm a particularly optimistic person, but I think you need to have hope. Like, I
Mm,
I think in order for you to recover from setbacks, you have to believe that the thing that you're aiming for or shooting for, or the vision that you have for your life, is much grander than the thing that is
yeah.
that you're facing at the moment. So I think you need to be like net optimistic, but I
Mm.
don't think you need to be like overall optimistic. What do you think?
Yeah. So you mean you don't need to be like a peppy, positive
Oh
Polly,
God, no, absolutely not.
which neither of us would fall
I
into.
don't think anyone who's listening to this probably is. I think they've self-selected out of the pod audience.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Yeah, I think that's interesting. What I would say is I think being a natural optimist, if you are peppy, Polly, or whatever I just said, that probably does help. Like
Mm,
actually, I think that probably does help. But I also believe that like pragmatism and realism is like a real powerful thing, and can also help you have that kind of ultimate resilience of like actually understanding not everything will be good, and that is fine.
yeah,
We'll get
totally. Like when you hit the setback and you no longer have this sort of organic optimism to rely on, that you have to fall back on making the most of what you've got with what you have, which is fundamentally just being pragmatic about it.
Exactly. And I think some people that get hit hardest with the, resilience depletion is actually the people that are incredibly optimistic when they realize that it's not all sunshine and roses and sometimes really bad things happen. I actually have definitely seen like really positive people be really, really flawed when something bad happened just because they was such an optimist that they almost didn't believe that like life happens to people. So I think it's the reason I asked you it is I think it's a really common misconception that all resilient people are optimistic, and I think
Mm.
that is just not true, you know.
Well, I mean, I'm now going to say that we're both very resilient people and not necessarily peppy ponies. So,
I assume I am, but I'm definitely not a peppy Polly.
Good. Okay. It's been lovely to chat, Annie. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. Next episode will be on hybrid working. As ever,
Concrete, that one, isn't it? Hybrid working, resilience, a bit more like factual. It's a bit of a different style.
it's very, very, very different to the emotional roller coaster of resilience, but
Yeah.
looking forward to getting into it. So if you have found us somewhere on a platform, please give us lots of stars, share with your friends so that other people can find us too.